All right, let's go. There is a man at the end of the table who looks exactly like you. Same jaw, same hands, same way of going still when the room gets loud. And you have been watching him run a criminal empire since before you understood what either of those words meant. He is your father. This is your inheritance. And tonight, for the first time, he is not at the head of the table. You are. You didn't choose this. That's the first thing people always get wrong. They picture a boy being groomed, pulled into back rooms, taught to count cash, handed a pistol at 13 like some kind of dark baptism. Sometimes it happened that way, but more often it happened the way everything in these families happened, gradually, then all at once. You went to school. You had dinner with your parents. You noticed that certain men always stood near the door. You noticed that your father never raised his voice, but other men went pale when he spoke. You noticed that no one on your block ever asked about your father's work. And then one day, maybe you were 19, maybe 22, someone needed a decision made, and the man who always made it wasn't there, and every person in the room turned to look at you. Not because you had earned it, because you were born with the name. What followed for the sons of the Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Bonnanos, the Colombos, the Lucases was not a career. It was a negotiation with gravity. Some of them fell fast. Some of them clawed. Some of them tried to walk away and learned that walking away from a thing like this is its own kind of trap. And a very small number of them, the ones who understood what they'd actually inherited, managed to hold the weight long enough to matter. This is their story, and tonight you're living it from the inside. What it felt like to carry a mafia surname before you'd done anything to earn it. It is 1974, and you are 15 years old, and you are sitting in a social club on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan on a Tuesday afternoon, because your father told you to be here at 3, and it is now 3:15, and no one has explained why. The room smells of espresso and cigarette smoke, and the particular human warmth of men who have been sitting in the same chairs for hours. There are 4 older men at a table near the window playing cards. There is a younger man behind the counter who keeps his eyes moving. No one speaks to you. No one has to. They know whose son you are. You are not here for a reason yet. You are here because being here is itself the reason. This is the day the room begins to include you, and it happens without ceremony, without a word spoken in your direction. The man behind the counter sets a glass of water in front of you and goes back to what he was doing. That's the whole of it. You notice that the men at the card table never look at the door, they face away from it, which means they trust whoever is standing behind you to handle the door. You notice that the younger man behind the counter, who cannot be more than 25, moves differently when a phone on the wall rings. He goes very still for 1 full second before answering, like a man deciding something. You notice that your father's name, spoken in this room, functions differently than it does at school or on the street. At school it is a rumor. Here it is a unit of measurement. When one of the card players finally addresses you, he does not ask your name. He says simply, "Your father is a serious man." He says it the way someone might say the weather is cold, not as praise, not as threat, just as a condition of the environment. The question that hangs after it unspoken is whether you are a serious man too. You are 15. You have no answer. Neither does anyone else in the room. The FBI's surveillance logs from Mulberry Street social clubs during the mid-1970s are extensive. Field agents documented foot traffic, identified regulars by face and later by name, noted arrival and departure times to the quarter hour. The logs that were eventually declassified through FOIA requests in the late 1990s show, among other things, the regular presence of minors in these establishments, sons, nephews, cousins, logged without comment, their presence noted as unremarkable by agents who had been watching long enough to understand that this was how the education worked. What the logs did not capture, because no microphone reached it, was the texture of what was being transmitted. Not orders, not criminal conspiracy, but posture. Effect. The particular way a man holds his shoulders in a room where he is known. These things pass between generations without a word being said, and no surveillance apparatus then in operation was calibrated to record them. The practice of introducing minors to organized crime social environments was addressed in a series of RICO prosecutions beginning in the mid-1980s, wherein prosecutors argued that familial proximity to criminal enterprise constituted a form of induction. Courts were largely unpersuaded by this framing absent evidence of direct participation. The sons themselves, in most cases, were not charged. Their fathers were. The official record treats the boys as background figures, present but legally uninvolved, their futures still unwritten at the time the indictments were handed down. And yet the official record's silence on the sons is itself a kind of document. The law could not charge a 15-year-old for sitting in a room. It could not indict a posture or a piece of knowledge absorbed through proximity rather than instruction. What the record does not resolve is the weight of a name in a room where names function as currency, and what it costs a boy to carry that weight before he has decided whether he wants to. The men who sat in those rooms as boys and later became bosses, underbosses, or cooperating witnesses spanned 3 decades in 4 cities. Most of them, when asked, said the same thing. They never had a moment of choosing. The choice had been made before they were old enough to understand there was one available. The Gambino family, and what happened the morning after Carlo died. It is the morning of October 16, 1976, and Carlo Gambino has been dead for less than 12 hours, and you are standing in a kitchen on Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn eating a piece of bread because someone put it in your hand and you did not know what else to do with your hands. The house is full of people. Women are moving between rooms with food. Men are standing near walls, not eating, talking in pairs with their mouths barely open. The phone has rung 11 times since 6 in the morning, and each time it is answered in the next room, out of your earshot. You are not the son of Carlo Gambino, but the man you work for is in that house, and the man he answers to is in that house, and everyone in that house is conducting, in real time, the first succession of the most powerful organized crime family in America since Lucky Luciano stepped back in 1946. No one is raising their voice. No one is crying. The bread in your hand is getting cold. Paul Castellano arrived at 9:40 in the morning. He is Carlo's cousin and Carlo's chosen successor, and he is 61 years old and built like a man who has spent his life in a room with a good view. And when he comes through the door, the quality of silence in the house changes. It does not deepen, it sharpens. 3 men who had been standing near the window move without being asked to positions near the doors. Neil Delacroce, who runs the street operations and who many in the room believe should have gotten the chair instead of Castellano, is already there when Castellano arrives. The 2 men greet each other. They shake hands. They stand close and speak for perhaps 4 minutes. No one else in the room is within 10 feet of them. What gets decided in those 4 minutes will determine the organizational structure of the family for the next 8 years. Delacroce walks away from the conversation, and his face gives nothing. Castellano walks toward the room with Carlo's widow and closes the door behind him. The question that no one in that kitchen can answer is what Delacroce was promised. The FBI's account of the Gambino succession, assembled largely from informant testimony and later confirmed in part by Henry Hill and others, holds that Castellano's ascension was smooth, that the family, respecting Carlo's wishes, fell in line behind his chosen heir without significant internal fracture. The newspapers reported it the same way. A quiet transfer of power, remarkable for its orderliness, evidence that the Gambinos operated more like a corporation than a street gang. What the informant testimony also contains, in portions that received less coverage, is a consistent description of significant resentment within the Delacroce faction, men who felt that the streets had been handed to a man who preferred to conduct business from his Staten Island mansion rather than from the neighborhoods that generated the money. The official narrative and the street-level account agree on what happened. They do not agree on how it felt. The succession of Paul Castellano as boss of the Gambino family was never the subject of criminal proceedings in its own right. It was addressed obliquely in subsequent RICO trials as context, background to later events, particularly the circumstances leading to the 1985 assassination of Castellano outside Sparks Steak House. The official record of the succession itself is thin. A death certificate, a will, real estate transfers. The criminal organization it governed was not recognized as a legal entity and therefore could not formally transfer leadership. The event exists in the record as an absence, something everyone knew happened and no document was equipped to describe. But the kitchen on Ocean Parkway is the detail that doesn't resolve. Not the power, not the succession, not the names of the men who moved toward the doors when Castellano came in, but the ordinary fact of bread going cold in someone's hand while history arranged itself in the next room. The gap between what the official record captured and what that morning actually contained is not a gap of facts. It is a gap of texture. And the men who were in that kitchen, some of whom cooperated, some of whom were prosecuted, some of whom died in ways that were not accidents, carried that texture for the rest of their lives. 9 of them, by the count of subsequent indictments, were in that house. The FBI would spend 11 years trying to reconstruct one morning that lasted 4 hours. The code of silence as it actually operated inside a family. You are 17 and your father has just been acquitted of a charge that, had he been convicted, would have sent him away for 12 years, and the two of you are driving home from the courthouse in a car that smells like his aftershave and the leather of the back seat, and he has not said a word since you left the building. You watched the verdict come in. You watched him nod once, shake his lawyer's hand, and walk out into the November cold as if he had just finished a meeting that ran slightly long. Now he is driving and you are watching the side of his face and you understand, for the first time with the full weight of your body, that this man has made a decision about what to carry alone, and that decision predates you, and that it will outlast him, and that at some point, not today, not soon, but at some point, it will become your decision too. The code of silence, the omerta, is not, as it is usually described, a rule against talking to law enforcement. That is the formal definition, the one that appears in FBI training manuals and organized crime literature. The operational version is something different and more demanding. It is a prohibition against acknowledgement. A made man does not acknowledge that he knows what he knows. He does not acknowledge, even to his own children, the specific shape of the world he inhabits. Joseph Colombo's son, Lawrence, described in a 1992 interview the experience of growing up knowing his father ran the Colombo crime family and never once hearing his father use those words. Not because his father was dishonest, but because the acknowledgement itself was the dangerous thing. The knowledge could live in a room between two people as long as neither one named it. The moment it was named, it became a different kind of thing. Colombo's father put his hand on the kitchen table and did not say a word. Lawrence Colombo was 20 when that happened. He did not ask. The FBI's understanding of omerta as a formal oath, sworn at induction ceremonies, binding under threat of death, was largely confirmed by the testimony of Joseph Valachi in 1963, which constituted the first time a made member of a New York crime family had described the internal rules of organized crime before a Senate committee. Valachi described a ceremony with candles, a burning piece of paper, a needle drawing blood from a trigger finger. The press ran the ceremony as the lead. What received less attention in the coverage was Valachi's description of what omerta actually governed day to day, not dramatic moments of interrogation, but the texture of ordinary life. Who you could eat dinner with, what questions you could answer at a school event, how you talked to your wife about where you'd been. The ceremony was the headline. The daily arithmetic of silence was the practice. The legal concept of the Code of Silence was addressed directly in the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization statutes, wherein prosecutors argued that the enforcement of omerta through violence or intimidation constituted a predicate act of racketeering. This framing allowed the silence itself, or more precisely, the mechanisms used to maintain it, to become evidence of the conspiracy. Courts accepted this argument in a series of cases through the 1980s and 1990s. The silence was criminalized not as silence but as coercion. What the statute did not reach was the silence that required no coercion, the kind that lived between a father and a son in a car driving home from a courthouse, enforced by nothing except the understanding that some knowledge, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. And yet, the law's account of silence as coercion is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not explain is why, when the coercion was removed, when men cooperated, when they entered witness protection, when they were finally free to say whatever they wanted, so many of them kept certain things back anyway. Not from loyalty, not from fear, from something that looks in the testimony transcripts a great deal like the habit of protection. They had spent so long keeping their children away from the specific shape of what they'd done that they could not stop, even in a federal building with immunity in hand. The list of cooperating witnesses who disclosed organizational structure, financial arrangements, and criminal acts, but declined to describe in any detail what their sons knew or didn't know, runs to 31 men across 5 families between 1980 and 2005. The prosecutors noted it. No one charged anyone for it. There is a point, somewhere between what you've just heard and what comes next, where the story stops being about other people. You're about to cross it. A famous son faces his defining moment. It is January 1992, and John Gotti is in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan awaiting trial on charges that will ultimately send him away for life, and his son, John Gotti Jr., 30 years old, already a capo in the Gambino family, is sitting across from him in a visiting room on a Wednesday morning. The room has no windows. The table between them is bolted to the floor. There are 2 other conversations happening nearby, both in low voices, and the corrections officer near the door is doing the particular kind of not watching that is also watching. The father and son speak for 40 minutes. What is discussed is not fully documented. What is known is that when John Jr. stood to leave, he was carrying something he had not come in with, not an object, not a document, but a weight that everyone who saw him in the weeks afterward noticed and no one asked about directly. John Gotti Jr. had been operating in the family since his mid-20s, first as an associate, then as a made member, eventually as a capo running crews in Queens. He was not, by the accounts of men who worked alongside him, a natural in the way his father was a natural. John Sr. moved through a room like a man born to be looked at. John Jr. moved through rooms like a man who had decided to be looked at. There is a difference, and people who operate in environments where that distinction matters tend to notice it. What changed in early 1992, what the men around him later described in court testimony, was that John Jr. stopped performing. He went quieter. He began appearing at meetings that he had previously delegated, sitting at the head of tables where his father's absence was the loudest thing in the room, and making decisions with an efficiency that some found reassuring and others found a different kind of concerning. The question no one in the organization had a clean answer to was whether he was leading or surviving. John Gotti Jr. was indicted in 1998 on charges including racketeering and extortion. Prosecutors argued that he had effectively assumed leadership of the Gambino family following his father's incarceration. The press covered the indictment as a dynasty story. Father and son, the succession of organized crime, the Godfather narrative made real. The trial testimony that received less coverage was the testimony of men who described John Jr.'s attempts, in the mid-1990s, to distance himself from the organization, attempts that were, according to those witnesses, genuine but structurally impossible. A man at the level John Jr. had reached could not simply stop. The organization did not have a resignation mechanism. The account in the indictment described a man pressing forward into leadership. The account in the courtroom described a man who had stopped moving and found the current carrying him anyway. John Gotti Jr. was tried 4 times between 1998 and 2009. The first 3 trials ended in hung juries. The fourth resulted in a guilty plea to 1 count of racketeering, for which he received time served. He was released. The official resolution of his case is, by the metrics of federal prosecution, incomplete 4 trials, 3 hung juries, a plea that satisfied neither side. The government did not formally establish that he had led the family. The defense did not formally establish that he had left it. The record sits between 2 positions, neither of which it endorses. But the visiting room in January 1992 does not appear in the trial record in any detail. It is noted, the visit occurred, the date is logged, and then the record moves on. What was said in that room between a father who was going away for life and a son who was being asked to hold something that had taken decades to build remains outside the official account? John Gotti Sr. died in prison in 2002. John Jr. has given interviews in which he has described his desire to leave the life, his eventual exit, his current distance from organized crime. What he has not described in any interview located in the public record is what his father said to him in that room on that Wednesday morning. In 10 years of trials, no prosecutor asked him directly. The visiting log for that date covers 40 minutes. The transcript is 40 minutes of silence. A historical event told from inside it. It is the summer of 1991, and the Colombo family is at war with itself, and you are driving a car on a residential street in Brooklyn at 11 in the morning with a man in the passenger seat who has not spoken since you left the diner 20 minutes ago. This is normal. Men in this business do not fill silences, but the silence this morning has a specific texture, the texture of a man who has received information he has not yet decided what to do with. The war started in June when a faction aligned with Victor Orna, the acting boss, moved against the imprisoned Carmine Persico and his son Alphonse, who was running the family on his father's behalf from the street. You are not leadership. You are not making the decisions. You are the man who drives the car, and right now the car is on a street in Brooklyn, and the silence in the passenger seat is doing something to the air that you can feel against your hands on the wheel. The Colombo War killed 12 men between 1991 and 1993 and wounded several others, and it happened in neighborhoods where people were outside in the summer on stoops, in front of bodegas, walking to the corner. It was not a war conducted in back rooms. It spilled. A man named Hank Smurra was shot on a street in Canarsie in broad daylight. A bystander named Matty Spiro was hit by a stray bullet and survived. The war generated more law enforcement attention than the Colombo family had seen in a decade, which was precisely what neither side wanted and both sides had produced anyway. The detail that no one in the organization had a clean answer for was Alphonse Persico, 34 years old, running a family in open warfare, his father directing from a federal prison cell in letters that were being read by the FBI before they reached him, trying to hold together an organization that had fractured on his watch, because of a decision his father had made years before he was old enough to be consulted. The FBI's account of the Colombo War, assembled through a combination of informant testimony, wiretaps, and surveillance, was presented in a series of prosecutions through the mid-1990s. The official narrative described a power struggle, Orna faction versus Persico faction, with clear organizational lines. What the prosecution testimony also contained, in sections that received less coverage than the murder charges, was a picture of an organization in which the lines were not clear at all, in which men switched sides, in which loyalties were geographic and personal rather than ideological, in which some participants did not know, on a given morning, which faction they were technically fighting for. The war that the government described was organized. The war that the participants described was a fog. The Colombo War was addressed through a series of RICO prosecutions that resulted in convictions for members of both factions. Victor Orna was convicted in 1993 and sentenced to life in prison. Alphonse Persico faced separate proceedings related to his role in the family's operations. The official resolution designated the Persico faction as having maintained nominal control, though the practical capacity of either faction to exercise authority following the prosecutions was, by most assessments, severely diminished. The war ended not because one side won, but because enough men had been removed from the field to make further fighting operationally impossible. And yet Alphonse Persico's position, a son running his father's organization during a war he did not start, is not a case study the official record knows how to classify. The indictments describe him as a principal. The men who worked around him describe something more complicated. A man trying to execute a strategy his father had conceived, in a conflict his father had precipitated, with resources his father's imprisonment had depleted, on a timeline his father could not see from inside a federal cell. The question of how much of what followed was his decision, and how much was the momentum of decisions made before he had any standing to influence them, was never put cleanly to a jury. The war lasted 2 years and produced enough funerals to fill 3 weeks of a single Brooklyn calendar. The son who inherited it was 34 years old when it started. He did not pick the fight. He was standing in it when it began. A decision point, the night you were asked. It is late. You don't know the exact time because you left your watch at home, and the clock on the wall of this room stopped sometime last winter, and no one replaced the battery. The room is on the 2nd floor of a building you have been to before but not often enough to know the layout well. You know the stairs. You know this room. You know the exit is 2 doors to the left and 14 steps down. There is one man sitting across from you and 2 men standing behind him, which is a configuration you have been in before and which always means the same thing. The man sitting is the one who matters and the men standing are the reminder. The man sitting is someone you have known since you were 11 years old. He used to bring food to your house on the holidays. He is not bringing food tonight. He is looking at you with the specific patience of a man who has already decided the answer and is waiting for you to arrive at it. He puts a name on the table between you, not a piece of paper, not an object, just a name said aloud once in the particular register that means the name is the question. You know the name. Everyone in the neighborhood knows the name. The name belongs to a man who has caused a problem, not for you personally, not yet, but for people whose problems are now, by virtue of where you are sitting and who your father was, adjacent to your problems. The man across from you does not explain what he needs. He does not outline the situation. He says the name, and then he waits, and the waiting is the offer and the question and the implicit understanding of everything that follows a yes. You are 26 years old. Your father has been dead for 2 years. The 2 men standing behind the man sitting do not move. One of them is holding his hands at his sides and the other has his arms crossed, and neither of them is looking at you, which means both of them are looking at you. The thing that has no clean answer is what your father would have done. You know what he would have done. That is the problem. The initiation ceremonies of the 5 New York families were described in detail in the testimony of multiple cooperating witnesses beginning in the 1980s. Joseph Pistone, who infiltrated the Bonnano family as an FBI undercover agent for 6 years, described the ritual of being proposed for membership. The way a sponsor vouched for a candidate, the way the candidate's background was discussed in rooms he was not in. The way the eventual invitation was extended not as an explicit offer, but as a summons whose purpose was understood without being stated. Pistone's account, confirmed by subsequent witness testimony, describes an induction process that relied almost entirely on implication. No one said, "We are asking you to join a criminal organization." The words were never those words. The understanding was total and the words were something else. The gap between what was said and what was meant was not an accident of language. It was structural. It was load-bearing. The legal question of whether an individual's participation in an organized crime initiation ceremony constituted informed consent to criminal enterprise was addressed in RICO prosecutions through a framework that treated the ceremony as evidence of knowing participation rather than as the threshold of it. Courts held that membership in a recognized organized crime family, as established through the ceremony, was itself sufficient to establish awareness of the organization's criminal nature. The consent question, whether a 26-year-old sitting across a table from a man who had known him since childhood was freely choosing, was not a question the statute was designed to adjudicate. But you said yes. That is the fact the record captures, and the record is not wrong about it. What it does not capture is the room, the stopped clock, the 14 steps to the exit you did not take, the way the man who knew you since you were 11 was patient in the specific way of someone who was not actually offering you a choice. The official account of organized crime recruitment describes a pipeline: exposure, association, proposal, induction. What the pipeline model does not account for is the gravitational quality of a name, yours, inherited, carried since before you had a chance to decide whether you wanted to carry it, in a room where that name was already doing work before you opened your mouth. You said yes. You have said it was a choice. The room, if it could speak, would describe it differently. The room would describe it as a foregone conclusion that had been building since the day you were born into the right family on the wrong block. Some things you can't unknow. You've just been told a few of them. What comes next is the part where you find out what they cost. A historical event. What happened when a Don's son said no? It is 1968, and Salvatore Bonnano is 26 years old and sitting in a room in Tucson, Arizona with his father, Joseph Bonnano, who built one of the 5 families of New York, and who has spent the last 3 years in a war with the commission that resulted in his exile from New York, the kidnapping that bears his name, and the complete collapse of his authority over the family he founded. Joseph is 53 and still carries himself like a man who believes the current situation is temporary. His son is looking at him across a distance that is not entirely physical. Joseph has a plan. He is going to return. He needs Salvatore to hold things together in his absence, to be the visible leadership while Joseph works from behind. Salvatore is going to tell his father no. He does not say it yet. But the decision is already in his posture, in the way he is sitting, in the particular stillness of a man who has already chosen and is waiting for the right sentence to deliver it. Salvatore Bonnano, Bill Bonnano, as he was known, had grown up inside the structure his father built. He had been present at meetings. He had delivered messages. He had, by most accounts, accepted the shape of the life he was moving toward with the equanimity of someone who had been given no meaningful alternative. What changed in the years of his father's exile, the years of watching the family fragment, watching men his father had elevated abandon the enterprise, watching law enforcement build a case brick by brick, was something that does not appear cleanly in any document but is visible, retrospectively, in the decisions he made. He moved to Arizona. He kept distance from New York. When his father needed a man to represent the family in a meeting with commission figures, Salvatore went, but he went as a negotiator, not as a claimant. He was not trying to take the chair. He was trying to find an exit that looked enough like loyalty that his father would not take it as a betrayal. The Bonnano family turbulence of the late 1960s was extensively documented by the FBI, which had been running surveillance on the family since the late 1950s. The official account, pieced together from wiretaps, informant reports, and later from Bill Bonnano's own memoir, describes a son who remained loyal to his father even as the family deteriorated around them. The memoir itself, Bound by Honor, published in 1999, presents a more complicated picture. A man who loved his father and understood, with increasing clarity, that the thing his father had built was going to consume anyone who tried to hold it. The official record and the memoir agree on the chronology. They do not agree on the emotional logic of it, on what it costs to watch something your father made come apart, and understand that the most loving thing you can do is not try to stop it. Joseph Bonnano died in 2002 at the age of 97, having outlived most of the men who had opposed him and most of the men who had supported him. He was never imprisoned for his organized crime activities, though he faced various legal proceedings over the years. Salvatore Bonnano died in 2008. He had, by the accounts of those who knew him in his later years, made a life outside the structure his father built, not entirely clean, not entirely free, but at a remove that would have been unimaginable in 1968. The official resolution of the Bonnano family's leadership crisis of the late 1960s was handled by the Commission, which effectively installed new leadership. The family continued. The son who refused did not disappear from the record. He simply moved to its margins, which is the closest thing to an exit the record contains. And yet the act of refusal, a son looking at his father and declining to carry what the father was offering, has no real category in the literature of organized crime families. The literature knows loyalty and betrayal. It knows cooperation and silence. It knows succession and violence. What it does not know well is the son who says, without informing and without defecting, simply, "Not me, not this." Bill Bonnano occupied that space for the rest of his life, too close to the family to be fully outside it, too deliberate in his withdrawal to be fully inside it. The room in Tucson in 1968 contained a conversation that neither man fully recorded and that the FBI, for all its surveillance, did not capture. It contained a father and a son discussing the disposition of something that could not legally be transferred and that neither of them could legally own. It contained a refusal that saved one of them and could not save the other. The distance between their chairs that day was perhaps 6 feet. The distance between their outcomes was everything. The decision point, what you were asked to do the night before the arrest. You are in the kitchen. It is past midnight. Your father is at the table and the overhead light is on and everything else in the house is dark and quiet, and you can hear, from somewhere outside, a dog that has been barking at the same interval for the last 20 minutes. Your father has a glass in front of him and a piece of paper that he folds when you come in, and you notice the folding, the deliberateness of it, the way he makes it small and puts it in his shirt pocket, and you understand that what was on that paper was not for you to read, and also that he wants you to know he has read it. He looks at you. He does not look like a man who is afraid. He looks like a man who has completed a long calculation and arrived at a number he does not like but can live with. He tells you to sit down. You sit down. He gives you a name and an address and a time. Not the name you are thinking of, not the obvious one. A different name, a lawyer's name, an accountant, someone who holds keys to things not literally, but in the way that matters more than literally, which is that he knows where things are, he knows how things are organized, he knows the shape of the structure well enough to describe it to people who would find the description useful. Your father needs this man to receive something before morning, not a threat, not violence. A package, an envelope, something that passes between hands in an ordinary way and becomes extraordinary by virtue of what it contains. He tells you the address. He tells you the time. He does not tell you what is in the envelope. He puts his hand flat on the table and looks at you and waits. The dog outside has stopped barking. In the silence, you become aware that you can hear yourself breathing, and that this awareness is new. The role of sons and close family members in the logistics of organized crime operations, as couriers, as intermediaries, as custodians of material that could not safely pass through the hands of known associates, is documented in FBI case files across multiple families. Prosecutors found, in case after case, that the men most useful for these functions were precisely the ones the organization had kept closest to the center and furthest from the record. The sons who were known in the neighborhood but not yet in the system, whose names had not yet appeared in surveillance logs, who could move through a city without triggering the pattern recognition that followed the known names. The official account of these individuals, when they appeared in proceedings, described them as participants in the enterprise. The account that emerged from their own testimony in the cases where they testified described something more specific. Men who had been handed a task on a night when the weight of the name they carried made refusal feel like a different kind of catastrophe than compliance. The legal treatment of family members who performed logistical functions for organized crime enterprises evolved significantly through the RICO era. Early prosecutions focused on named principals and their direct associates. Later prosecutions, informed by a more sophisticated understanding of how these organizations insulated their leadership, began to reach further to the couriers, the intermediaries, the men who delivered envelopes in the middle of the night to lawyers who asked no questions. Some of these men were charged, some were offered cooperation agreements, some were given time to consider. The official record of each case is specific: a charge, a plea or verdict, a sentence. What the record does not contain is the kitchen at midnight, the folded paper in the shirt pocket, the dog that stopped barking at exactly the wrong moment. But you went. That is the fact. You took the envelope and you drove to the address and you handed it to the man who was waiting for it and you drove home before dawn, and you were in your bed when the phone rang at 6:30 in the morning, and the voice on the other end told you your father had been arrested. The official account of what you did that night classifies you, depending on the case, as a co-conspirator, as a material witness, as an unindicted party. None of these classifications describe the kitchen. None of them describe the way your father put his hand flat on the table, not to threaten, not to command, just to steady himself in the particular way of a man who knows he is about to ask something he has no right to ask. The envelope was delivered. The arrest happened anyway. The thing that does not close is the question your father never answered and you never asked: whether he knew, when he sent you out that night, that the arrest was coming, and whether he sent you anyway because he needed the envelope delivered, or because he needed you out of the house when they came through the door. What it felt like to sit in a federal courthouse and say nothing. You are in a federal courthouse, and it is the third week of your father's trial, and you are in a corridor outside the courtroom on a wooden bench that has been worn smooth by decades of people sitting on it, and waiting in exactly the condition you are in now, which is the condition of knowing something a room full of people on the other side of that door needs to know, and having decided, in a way that felt more like arriving somewhere than making a choice, that you are not going to say it. Your lawyer is next to you. He has a briefcase on his knee and he is looking at the middle distance, and occasionally he says something procedural in a low voice and you nod. Through the door you can hear, faintly, a voice asking a question. You cannot make out the words. You do not need to. You know the questions. You have known the questions for months. The answers are in the room on the other side of the door. You are on this side. The bench is warm from the people who sat here before you. Your father, when you saw him this morning before the session, looked at you for a long time without speaking. Not a long time by ordinary measure, perhaps 4 seconds, 5. But in a courthouse corridor at 8 in the morning with lawyers moving between you and a federal marshal standing near the door, 4 seconds is long enough. He did not tell you what to do. He has not told you what to do throughout this process, not directly, not in visits, not in the calls that you both know are monitored, not in the letters that arrive with the particular crispness of paper that has been unfolded and refolded by people who read it before it reached you. He has told you, in those 4 seconds this morning, nothing and everything. What you noticed was that he looked, for the first time in your memory, like a man who has accepted the possibility of losing. Not like a man who has given up, like a man who has made peace with an outcome he cannot fully control. This distinction, which is everything, is visible in the set of the shoulders and the quality of the eyes, and it is not something you could explain to anyone who had not grown up watching his face for exactly this information. The phenomenon of family members declining to testify against organized crime defendants, invoking the Fifth Amendment, claiming lack of knowledge, or simply being found to have no legally compellable information, is extensive in the federal record. Prosecutors in organized crime cases have, since the RICO era, operated with the understanding that family members constitute the most reliable segment of the population in terms of information access, and the least reliable in terms of willingness to use that access on behalf of the government. The official record of these decisions is procedurally clean. A witness invokes a constitutional protection or is deemed non-compellable, and the record moves on. What is not in the record is the negotiation that preceded the decision, the conversations with lawyers, the weight of the relationship, the specific texture of the moment when a person decides that what they know will stay with them. The case against your father was resolved through a combination of cooperating witness testimony, documentary evidence, and the inference chains that federal prosecutors assembled from financial records and surveillance. He was convicted. The sentence was handed down in a room you were not in because your lawyer advised you not to be there for the sentencing. The conviction is a matter of public record. Your name appears in the record as a related party, a family member, a person of potential interest who did not, ultimately, become a witness. The case is closed. The file is complete. The official story has a beginning and an end, and you are in neither of them, which is the result of the conversation you had with your lawyer and the 4 seconds in the corridor this morning and everything that came before both. And yet the bench in the corridor knows your weight. The wood has it now, alongside the weight of everyone who waited there before you. The official record is correct that you did not testify. It does not record what it costs to not testify, not in money, not in legal exposure, but in the specific currency of carrying knowledge that a room full of people needed and keeping it in your body instead. Your father was convicted without your testimony. He went away. The corridor bench was replaced in a renovation 6 years later. The trial transcript runs to 4,000 pages. Your name appears in it twice, once as a family member referenced in a financial document, once as a witness who was not called. Those are the facts. The facts are complete. What they do not contain is the 4 seconds in the corridor, and the shoulders, and the quality of the eyes, and what you decided it meant, and what you carried out of that building and kept. What you're about to hear is the part you don't get to walk away from. You've been building toward it since 10. This is the room you've been walking toward the whole time. The night you became the Dawn, and what that actually meant. You are at the head of the table. This is the first time. The room is the same, the same walls, the same smell of food from earlier in the evening, the same light fixture that has been casting the same quality of yellow light since before you were born. The men around the table are men you have known your entire life. Some of them are older than you by 20 years. Some of them were in this room before you were allowed in this room. They are looking at you with an expression you have seen directed at your father so many times that your body knows it before your mind does. The expression of men who are waiting. Not impatiently for the person at the head of the table to begin, because the person at the head of the table is the one who determines when things begin. You are 31 years old. Your father is gone. The chair is warm. Someone was sitting in it before you came in, keeping it from looking empty. They stood when you entered. They moved. You sat down. And now you are here and the room is waiting, and you have approximately 60 seconds before the waiting becomes something else. What you notice is how quiet it is. You have been in rooms like this your whole life, and they are never quiet. They are full of the low-frequency noise of men who are careful but not silent, the sounds of coffee cups and chairs, and the occasional murmured exchange at the edge of the room. Tonight the room is quiet in a way that feels deliberate, and you understand that the quiet is a gift and also a test. The man to your left, who is 54, who has run operations in this city for 15 years, who has more experience and more relationships and more leverage than anyone else at this table, has his hands flat in front of him and is looking at you with the particular neutrality of a man who has not yet decided what he thinks. You know this man. You grew up calling him uncle. He is not your uncle. He is the person who will determine in the next several months whether what you say and do in this chair has any reality outside of this room. To your right is a man who was loyal to your father in ways that cost him, personally, a great deal, who went to prison for 18 months rather than cooperate, who came out thinner and quieter and entirely unchanged in his position. He is looking at you the way a man looks at something he has already decided to protect. The difference between the two men, one who is measuring you, one who has already chosen, is the whole of what you have to work with. The silence lasts. You have not spoken yet. You are about to. The succession of organized crime leadership from a father to a son was, in every documented case, an event that the families handled with maximum opacity and minimum formal acknowledgement. The FBI's understanding of these transitions came, in most cases, weeks or months after the fact, pieced together from surveillance that showed changed patterns of deference, from informant reports that described the new name being spoken with the specific gravity that indicated authority, from financial flows that began routing through different hands. The newspapers covered these successions as human interest stories. The dynasty, the inheritance, the son in the father's shoes. What neither the surveillance nor the newspapers captured was the first meeting, the room, the silence, the two men flanking you with their different qualities of attention. The succession in the official account is a fact established retroactively. In the room, it is a proposition, something being offered and waited upon, not yet confirmed, still contingent on the next sentence out of your mouth. The legal treatment of organized crime leadership succession is addressed through the conspiracy provisions of RICO, wherein assuming a leadership role in a criminal enterprise constitutes a predicate act regardless of how that role was conferred. The law does not recognize inheritance as a defense. It does not distinguish between a son who chose the chair and a son who sat down in it, because every other option had been foreclosed. The role and the act are the same thing in the statute. The official record of successors who were prosecuted does not contain a category for the specific weight of that chair. It contains charges, verdicts, sentences. These are the closing documents of decisions that were made in rooms the record never entered. But here is what you know, sitting in that chair with the room waiting and the man to your left still measuring, and the man to your right already committed. You know that your father sat here. You know what it cost him. You know the morning phone calls and the courthouse corridors and the envelopes delivered before dawn and the folded paper in the shirt pocket and the 4 seconds in a corridor where he looked at you and said nothing and said everything. You know the weight of the name, not as an abstraction, not as a story about other people, but as a physical thing you have been carrying since you were 15 years old, sitting in a social club on Mulberry Street wondering why you were there. You know that the man to your left will decide based on what you say next. You know that the man to your right would follow you into a building that was on fire. You know that the room will not stay quiet much longer. And you know this is the thing that doesn't close, the thing that will not resolve regardless of how this meeting ends or how the next 10 years of your life unfold. You know that there was a moment, somewhere between the day you were born with this name and the day you sat down in this chair, when a different outcome was possible. You cannot locate that moment precisely. You have tried. It might have been the afternoon on Mulberry Street. It might have been the night with the envelope. It might have been the morning in the courthouse corridor when your father looked at you for 4 seconds and you looked back. You cannot find the moment. What you can find is this room, this chair, this silence, and the fact that you are in it, not because you chose it exactly, and not because it was done to you exactly, but because you are your father's son in a room full of men who know what that means, and the only question left is what you are going to do with it now that you're here. You open your mouth, you begin. The thing that connects every person you just lived through is not the organization. It's not the name of the family or the city or the decade. It's the specific weight of being born into something that does not have an exit clearly marked. Some of them found one anyway. Some of them are in federal databases. Some of them are in cemeteries in Brooklyn. And some of them, the ones whose stories don't appear in trial transcripts or newspaper archives, are living out the remainder of lives that nobody ever fully recorded, carrying the texture of rooms that no surveillance apparatus was calibrated to capture. The official record has the facts are correct, but you just spent some time in the rooms behind the facts, and if you paid attention you noticed the thing the facts don't carry, The stopped clock, the warm bench, the silence that had a texture, the shoulder set of a man making peace with an outcome he can't control. These things are not in the files.